Hi there, this is Chris with LaunchCode, and this is going to be a short, kind of informal lesson on working with forms in JavaScript, handling form data, responding to form submit events, and some basic data validation within forms using JavaScript on the client side. So here's kind of what we're starting with in terms of how our page looks. We're going to start with the user registration form that has 4 fields: a username, email, password, and verify password. So we've seen forms like this in the past when working on the back end of web applications. We're going to look a little bit at how we can look at validating form input and working with form data on the front end in similar situations. Okay, so here's my file that I'm starting with. And so I've just kind of stubbed out that HTML that we just looked at. I have an H1 at the top. Then I have a form element. And within my form element, I've used a table just to give the presentation a little bit of structure so that things are laid out a little bit more nicely. So if I hadn't used a table, all these form inputs would be stacked up against the names and things would not look as well aligned as they are here. So that's just the reason for that. And then down below the form, I have a section for JavaScript, which we'll be adding in quite a bit of code to. Just as a note, a best practice is to put your script tags generally, in most situations, at the end of your HTML documents, just before the closing body tag. And this has to do with the way that browsers will parse and execute JavaScript. And so this is generally going to be a more advantageous place for you to put your code so that your JavaScript elements, your JavaScript code is able to access the elements in the page that are above it. Okay. And we'll have more to say about page loading and those sorts of events when we look at jQuery. Okay, so let's just look at what is in our form. We have these 4 fields, and each one just has a label within a TD, then a table data tag. Then there's an input corresponding to each one. Now, these inputs are the actual components of our form that will allow the user to enter data. There are lots of different types of form inputs. We're using 3 different types here. So text, email, password, and password. There lots of different types, text areas, checkboxes, radio groups, things like that. So when you want to use a different type of form input, just go ahead and refer to resources on the internet like the Mozilla Developer Network or W3C on those types of forms. And we'll, of course, introduce a few of those as we go through the class. These are kind of some of the most basic that allow just kind of text entry. This is just a plain text. The username field is just a plain text entry field. The email field here, I have added this email type that will allow the browser to verify some simple formatting with regard to email addresses. And I'll show you how that works in a moment. And then the password and verify password fields both have type equals password, and this just specifies that when we're typing into these fields, the characters that we're typing should not be visible on the screen, so that if someone, say, were looking over your shoulder while you were filling out this form, they wouldn't be able to see your password. Okay, so that's always a best practice to use type equals password whenever you're working with a password field. So every input within our form, we have these four text-based inputs. Each of these inputs has a name attribute. All right, so every input in your form, aside from the submit button doesn't need an attribute, a name attribute, but every data element in your form should have a name attribute, and the name attribute is what is going to be used to pass that data to the server. So when you hit submit on your form and the data goes to a server, that is going to be bundled up into the HTTP request, and the value that the user typed into this field will be accessible via the username property. The value that's typed into this field will be accessible via the email property, and so on. We'll also be able to access the form fields and the data that they contain within our JavaScript using the same names. So just to reiterate, it's very important to use the name attribute in all of your form data fields. Okay, so so down here below, just to summarize the last input element, we have an input of type submit. That's going to be our submit button. The value of that is the text that appears on that submit button. You can leave that off and it will just say submit by default, but we just customized ours a little bit here to say register. All right, and then I have an empty JavaScript tag below that we're going to add to very soon. So let's go ahead and look at what we can do to respond to a submit event. That's going to be the first thing that we want to do in terms of validating our form data. We want to be able to catch the form submission once the user hits the submit button, but before the request goes to the server. So there are different ways of doing this. In order to do it, though, we're going to need to have a way within our JavaScript to basically query for the form element within our page. So to do that, I'm going to use the ID method. I'm going to go up here to my form and say ID equals user registration. And now that my form has an ID, I can then query for that element based on its ID in JavaScript. So let's go down below and we'll go ahead and make a variable form, var form equals document. So document refers to the global document object, which below which lives all of the elements of our page. That's part of the document object model, or the DOM. And I can say get elements by ID. And this method will let me query for any element in the page based on a specific ID string. So my ID was user registration. Okay, so as long as something with this ID exists in my page, which it does up here, this query will fetch that DOM element and store it in the form variable. Okay, so that's going to be our form. We can then set up an event to catch the submission of that form data as follows. So we want to say form.add event listener. Add event listener will add just that, an event listener or an event handler, as we'll often say, to the given element. So this will add a listener that listens for certain state changes of our form. In particular, we want to listen for a submit event. All right, so we want this listener that we're about to hook up to respond to submit events on the form. In other words, when somebody submits the form, we want this listener to be run. Okay, and so now we actually have to, after the submit event, we have to specify what code we want to run when the user submits the form. In order to do this, I'm going to back up just a couple of lines, and I'm going to create a function here to do this. And I'm just going to call it validate form. Okay, so now that I have this function here, I can go ahead and use it by name in my add event listener. All right, so to reiterate, line 43, this says that we want to add an event listener that's listening to the submit event on our form, and when the submit event runs, we want this function to run as well. Okay, and when we're working with event handlers, we generally want to be able to access the event object. When our browser calls this code, it will pass our form handler an event object that will have information about what the user just did, and that's going to often be valuable to us, and we're going to use it in a specific way in just one moment. Okay, so let's go ahead and just add a couple more things here so we can go ahead and test our code and see what it's doing when it's catching and handling these form events. So basically what I want to do here is, the first thing within my validate form method that I want to do, let's go ahead and just log our form to the console. So we'll be able to just kind of poke around and see what's within our form object by doing that. And then I also want to say event.prevent default. Okay, so we're using this event object and we're calling the prevent default method on it. And that is going to essentially halt the submission of the data to the server, right? So throughout this example, we're going to just want to work with form data in our browser. If we hit the submit button, by default, when you hit submit, even if you're running some validation code or some other type of event handler, that form data will still be sent to a server somewhere. Okay, and that's usually specified by the action attribute on your form, which we're not using because we're going to, be be stopping that action, but normally you would have action equals, some location where that data would be submitted to be processed by a server. We're not going to be concerned with that. We're going to prevent our form from being submitted each time by using event.preventDefault. Again, normally you wouldn't do this in all cases when you're working on a web application. You would only want to prevent the default form submission, say in the case that you found invalid data or mismatching passwords, for example. In this case, we're doing it because we're not backed up by a server here, and we just want to look at what's going on in the browser. Okay, let's go ahead and see how we did here and see if our code works. So I'm going to go over here to Firefox. If you're using Chrome, of course, things will look similar. So I've got my 4 form fields. Let's go ahead and just fill out some data here. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and open up my browser tools. So again, I'm in Firefox. If you're in a different browser, don't worry about that. Just open up your browser tools. You'll still have a console, and the same concepts will still apply, even if the UI just looks slightly different. So I open this up just so I can see that the console.log, when it spits out that form to my console, I can go ahead and look at it. So let's go ahead and hit the register button, which is going to submit our form. Okay, so notice that 2 things happened there. One is we did see this form element show up below in our console, and we can poke around and click through and look at the data within that form element. Also notice that my form didn't go anywhere. I didn't actually submit anything to a server, and that's because we used the prevent default. Okay, so this is going to allow us to just keep playing on this without having our page just kind of fly away from underneath us and send data to a server. All right, so let's go ahead and click on this form element, and we can look at some of the data that's inside of it. So this guy is an object. It represents the form element within our document. It's part of the DOM. We can see that when we hover over it, the browser tools will show us where it lives within the page. And over here, we can see some of the data that's inside of it. So form objects are going to be sort of array-like in the sense that they're going to let us access elements within the form using an index the same way we would access elements within an array. And everything within that sort of array-like form is going to be an input from our form. So again, I can hover over these and see which ones that it's looking at. The first one is the username. The second one is the email, password, verify, and then the submit as well. You can poke into these and see the data that's within each of the form elements. And there's just a lot of default stuff here. So the DOM elements, DOM objects are going to have a lot of different attributes and methods attached to them based on the structure that the document object model provides. Okay, so we'll be able to use this to our benefit to work with our forms in JavaScript. So notice that a form is not an array, right? So it said it has this array-like behavior because it has the input elements stored in it in an indexed way, but there's also all this other stuff that arrays don't normally have. And so, while the form object can be treated like an array in terms of getting the elements out of it and looking at the inputs, it isn't an actual array. It's what we would call an array-like object in JavaScript. Okay, so we're going to kind of iterate on some tasks and kind of build up to the point where we can verify that the user has entered the correct information. But before we do that, we're going to take some baby steps. I just want to take this moment right here to show you what some of the input types are doing for us up in our form. So I have 3 different input types: type equals text, type equals email, and then type equals password. So we see the effect of putting type equals password on the password and verify password, right? We get the little dots. If I left this off, I would be able to see those characters visibly in the screen. That's the effect of that. Let's look at the effect of the type equals email. Okay, so an input element of type equals email is a text element, but it has this extra feature that allows for some really basic email formatting validation. So if I go in here and just put something that isn't correct, the browser is going to notify me visually that that is not correct. See, then we get the red highlight. And if we were trying to submit it, it would be a little bit more explicit in saying, please enter an email address. Okay, now this email address validation, depending on the browser, isn't going to be perfect. I can go ahead and put in something that, doesn't look like a valid email address, and it still let me submit there, as we see by the log statement that it is within our submit handler, that did not prevent me from doing so. So, you shouldn't rely just on these input types to do all your form validation. They're going to be helpful and one tool in your toolkit in order to make sure that the data you're getting from your forms is good data. Okay. All right. There's one more element that we'll look at in form input. So let's go ahead and look at that now. I have a password and a verified password, but if I let me go ahead and refresh this page. If I were to say, leave these out and hit the register button, I would see that my form is still submitted. Okay, so there's a simple way to specify to the browser that you think form elements should be required by the user to be filled out. And that's simply to go to those inputs and add this little required guy. Okay. Now, obviously, this isn't going to do all the validation. We're going to have to do some manual work to make sure that these two match. That's coming. But at the very least, this will prevent the user from trying to submit the form before they've actually typed something in. So it just means that when our code runs in the event handler, our form will, we can be sure that these two things are not empty. All right, so let's go ahead and refresh and see that that works. Okay, so if I try to submit now, both of these fields are highlighted, and the browser kicks me back up to the first one that failed, the browser's validation. And I can do that if I put something in here. And then if I still leave that one blank, it will, again, yell at me. All right, so that's some really basic, validation that you can do within your HTML. Like I said, though, validation is a multifaceted, multi-step process. You don't want to rely on any one tool to do it. You want to have layers of validation. You want to use these HTML attributes and parameters. You want to use your JavaScript. And if you're working on server code, you also want to validate on the server. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at how we can work with data within our form objects. Okay, so let's go back to our validate form function here. And so this is the function that's running when the submit event is triggered by the user submitting the form. And we saw that we were able to log the form and prevent the form from being submitted to a server. We're going to go here in the middle of this code, and we want to go ahead and print out all of the form data. And we want to put this out to the web page, basically. Okay, so let's see. To do that, I'm going to need to loop over this form, this array-like form object. So I'm going to create a for loop. For I equals 0, I less than form.length, I plus plus. Okay, and then each time around, I can say, that I can get the input element. So I'm going to create a local variable inside my for loop input, and I'm going to set this equal to form bracket I. That will get the ith input element out of the form. So as we loop from I equals 0 up till the end of the list of form elements, we'll get each one out. And then I want to go ahead and be able to put both the key and the value, or the name and the data value of each form element, and build up a string to print to the screen. So to do that, let me add a couple of things here. Let me go up here and add a var form data stir. Okay, so I'm just going to make an empty string. We're going to add to this to add each form data element as we go. And so now within this loop, I can work with the form data string, form data stir variable. And so I can do it this way. So I'm going to say form data stir plus equals, and I'm going to use a B tag just to highlight this stuff in bold. And I can get to the input elements. I can get to its name by just using input.name. Okay. And that's going to be the name of each input. So then let me just add a little bit more formatting. Okay, so this will spit out the input name surrounded in B tags, which will just make that bold for us. And then I'm going to add on to that the input dot value. And then let me put a BR tag at the end to send us down to the next line. So input.value will give you the data value of that form element. In other words, it's the data that the user typed in or that the user selected or however that might work given the form input type that you're working with. It's the value of that form input. It's the actual data. Whereas the name is the key. It's the name we use to refer to that form input. Okay, so that's going to be one line. And then as we loop through this, we're going to get every data element spit out. Now I need a place to put this, right? I want to be able to see it on the screen. So let me go back up to my HTML. And after the form, I'm going to make a div. And I'm going to call this, I'm going to give it an ID of form data display. Okay, and then I can come down below and I can access that and say var output div equals document dot get elements by ID, just as we did before. And I can add the form data display right there. Okay, so this is going to fetch the DOM element representing this div and put it inside the output div variable. Okay, and then to insert the string into that, I can say output div dot inner HTML equals form data stir. Okay, so this line fetches the div out of the page, and this sets the inner HTML attribute, which represents the content of the div, the HTML content of the div, and it sets it to be equal to this thing that we just built up, which is all the text containing the name value pairs for our form. Okay, so we'll save, and then we'll come back and refresh, and we'll see how we did. Okay. And let's see, we've got something's going on there. We have some type of error because the form actually did not submit. So I'm going to go ahead and, in order to do this, I'm going to move this up, this prevent default, in order to debug this issue. I'm going to move this up so that I prevent the default before I do anything. My suspicion is that the error, I've got some syntax error, you know, within this code here, right? So I just want to make sure that I prevent the default form submission before I hit that error, and then hopefully that'll help us figure this out a little bit better. Okay, so let's refresh and let's debug. Okay, so that didn't really help us. We see that we did get this spit out to the screen still, so we're hitting this line of code. Let's see, we have input equals form I. All right, so I'm gonna have to be a little bit more specific about what I'm doing to debug this issue. I'm going to head and use my browser's JavaScript debugger. So we'll spend an entire lesson looking at browser tools in the debugger, but you should already have used them a little bit in Unit 2, and feel free to get comfortable with them. So I can go into the JavaScript code within my page and set breakpoints. Let me go ahead and set a breakpoint here. That's the first line of my validate method. Okay, and then I hit submit, and I've stopped at this breakpoint. And so let's go ahead and just kind of step through this and see what happens. So my form data stir was created correctly. All right, so on the first pass, I have my input is right here. That seems to be the correct one. Should be the first input. Okay, and then I've added form data stir, username. Those are the right values. Okay, so let's go ahead and step through this. That seems to be working correctly. Now we're on the last input. Okay, now we're down at the var. Ah, I see it right here. So there's my error. So I typed get element by as opposed to get element by ID. All right, so this is one of the issues with JavaScript, is that errors tend to be swallowed a little bit or not kind of reported in the same way. You just want to be careful about this because it's going to be trickier to find your problems in your JavaScript code. All right, there we go. Let's go ahead and refresh over here, and hopefully this will work. Okay. So let's see. So we have 4 form fields that were printed out here: the username, the email, the password, and the verify. It looks like I've done something wrong with my B tags. Let's go back and look at that. Yep, I didn't close them. There we go. Let's close our B tags. All right, that looks better. So yeah, this looks good. So we were able to access the name and the value of each input element within our form. Notice that this didn't, as we saw before, this didn't really validate the email address to the extent we would really like, but it's okay. We can handle that with a more manual process if we wanted to. Notice this thing at the end though. What's that? So my 5th line of the output that I spit out has a colon register. And so why are we doing that? We only have like 4 text inputs here. What is this? Well, the deal is that this input element, this submit button, is still an input element. So when I loop over my form object, my array like form object, I'm going to get a 5th element that is the submit button. It really doesn't correspond to any data that we're sending to the server, right? So, we might want to avoid printing this out. Let's go ahead and see how we can easily do that. I can, within my loop, just put a conditional, and I can say if, and then I can only add that element to the string if it's not, actually I need to do this first. I need to put the input before. And so I can only add this element to the string if it's not a submit button. So how do I test that? I can say input.type. There's a type attribute, and I want to say not equals. So if the type of the input is not submit, then we want to go ahead and add that to the string we're building up. Let's go ahead and test that out. Okay, great. So we're leaving off that stray random input that's the submit button. So we're throwing a lot of stuff at you here, a lot of different attributes, a lot of different things. How would you know to do this on your own? And how are you going to navigate this while you're working on your own? The answer is that, obviously you can use the internet and references and material we provide, but there's also a lot you can learn just from poking around in the page in your browser tools. So if I go ahead and say inspect this button, I can go over here and say show DOM properties. Again, this might be slightly different for your browser tools if you're using Google Chrome or another browser. And I can go ahead and look at this stuff, and I can see all the properties that are available on my given DOM objects, right? There are all these things don't necessarily align to something I might use. Let's look at attributes, right? So attributes, these are things we've added. Value equals register, type equals submit. Those are HTML attributes that we put on our submit button. Child nodes, there are no child nodes. If we were looking at the form, it would have child nodes. Children, similar thing. Let's see. Default value is register. Disabled is false. There's a lot of stuff here. The form that it's contained in is the user registration form. There's a lot of stuff you can see here just by poking around. Let's go all the way down and look for type. Okay, so we have type submit. There we go. So if I forgot what the string was going to be for that DOM element, I could go ahead and poke around and figure it out. And that's a great way to learn things aside from just looking things up on the internet. Okay. So we were able to access our form elements one at a time using that loop. You can also access form elements using the name of the form element. So let's go ahead and log to the console. We'll just look at one specific example of this. I want to access the username from my form by name. So I can say form.username and use this dot notation, and this will access the data element with name equals username inside my form and log it to the console. So let's go back over to our browser, and I open up my console, and we'll hit refresh. Okay, so when I submit this time, I'm still logging the form there, but the second one is the input element with name equals username, and I was able to access that using this dot notation. So there's two ways we've seen to access data elements from forms, inputs from forms. One is using the dot name approach right here. The other is indexing into it using bracket notation, using the array-like nature of a form. And so both of these will be useful to you at various points in time. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get rid of that since we don't really need it. It was just for a demo. Okay, so now we want to go ahead and add some basic data validation. We're to the point where we're able to catch our form submission and look at the data within it. Let's go ahead and add some behaviors to figure out if the form data is valid. So we're not going to kind of go all in terms of what should be valid for our form. You might say that the username should be have between 6 and 25 characters. At the email, we might be more rigorous with that. Basically, what we're going to do in this case is we're just going to check a couple of basic things. We're going to check that the password and the verify password match, and we're going to check that our username has a certain length string. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back and do that. I'm actually going to delete this code. This is mostly for display purposes. I'm going to leave this one though. We're still going to use that output div to output any kind of success or failure validation message. So let me delete this loop. And we'll have to come back to this. Okay, so I want to now validate password. Let's check that. Okay. And I'm going to make a string here. I'm going to make a var report string. And I'm just going to make this by default success. And then I can overwrite this if I find at some point down here that I fail validation. And let me go ahead and put the report string in the div. Okay, so let's validate the password. So I want to check to see if the password field matches the verify field, or the values of those fields rather. So let's go ahead and make an if statement. And my conditional I want here is if form.password, we just saw that we can access this field by name, .value, that will get the value of the field. If that is not equal to form.verify.value. Okay, so I'm checking to see if the value of the password field matches the value of the verify field. If that's not the case, I want to say report stir equals invalid, or let me say passwords do not match. Okay, let's go ahead and test that out. And I'm going to put in 2 different passwords here. And I got do not match. Let me go ahead and put in the same password twice. And I see success. Okay. So one more piece of form validation that we want to add as an example here is to check the length of the username field. Let's go ahead and add that one. I'm going to do this first since it's before the, well, actually let's kind of do it this way. Let's kind of chain these things together. So let's say we'll check for the password fields and say if they don't match. Before that, we'll check if these don't, and then we'll kind of do one level of validation at a time. So we'll use an else if. different ways you can do this. Yeah, let's do it this way. So this will check first to see if the username field is correct. I'm going to move my comment to be appropriate here. Here we're going to validate the username. We're first going to check to see if the username has the right validation parameters. In this case, we just want to make sure that it's long enough. And if it is long enough, we'll go ahead and validate the password. So we're just going to check one for one error at a time. If there are multiple errors, we'll only report the first one we found. So I want to check the value of the username field. So I'm going to say form.username.value, and this will have a length because it's a string. And if that is less than, say, 5 characters long, we'll say report stir username must contain at least 5 characters. Okay, and let's go check that. And let's see, I misspelled length. So that's why that didn't work. Let's go ahead and refresh. There we go. So we see username must contain at least 5 characters. I only put 4. Let's go ahead and add some. Submit again, and we see success there. If we had done this with mismatched passwords, it would have validated the username as being correct, but the passwords as not being correct. Okay, so if you were dealing with a situation where you were sending data to a server, you would want to check for these various validation parameters or situations. And if, aside from just reporting a message, you would also want to prevent the default behavior right here, which we do in every case. You would want to check that, and only prevent the default behavior if the form failed validation. Okay. So yeah, that's some basic stuff about form validation using JavaScript and events and accessing form data elements in your JavaScript code.